Hello and welcome to Scribes and Songsters. I'm Veronique Mandel. In our studio today, we're delighted to have Laurie Brett with us. Laurie is here to discuss her recently released book, The Rising Village, An Early History of Essex, Ontario. Laurie's great-grandfather became the owner and publisher of the Essex Free Press in 1895, and for the next 109 years, her family published the newspaper every week, very involved in the community's daily activities and recording its history. Laurie has now compiled these stories and rich history into a fascinating book, and we're really pleased to have her here to tell us all about it. Welcome to Scribes and Songsters.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
You certainly have packed a lot into this book.
I'm surprised at it myself.
So now, before we get to talking about the book, as I've just said, your family has a tremendous history of documenting people and events in Essex.
That's right. Yeah, and that's because of owning the Essex Free Press and being very involved in current events, but also involved in preserving the history of the community as well.
Yeah. And it's, I was thinking about this as I was reading your book and knowing that, 109 years is a long time to be learning about an area, isn't it?
It is. Well, some of the Bretts who owned the paper owned for a very long time. I think some of them owned for 40 years. It was just my great-grandfather, then my uncle, my dad and his partner, and then I owned it at the end. So, but some of them owned it for 4 and 5 decades.
Wow. Yeah. So, as a journalist, a question I wanted to ask you was, what's it like to own a paper?
Well, as you probably well know, it is challenging. It is challenging and it's stressful. And as you know, circumstances have changed dramatically in the last 20 years or so. And it's very competitive, right? You need advertising dollars. They're difficult to come by these days, and people don't want to pay for newspapers. If we continue to have subscription-based newspapers would survive and do well, but somebody has to pay the bills. And you want good journalists. You want good journalism. And, that comes at a cost. And you want good photography and good graphic design. And staff who are dedicated to staying late, working like holidays. Monday was never a holiday at the newspaper because we went to press at the end of the day.
Yes.
So difficult, also exciting. And, I learned more about the town and the people who lived in it over many generations because I owned the paper, because people wanted to tell me. They wanted to talk to me. They wanted to show me pictures. They wanted to share books. And so because I always had an interest in history, I collected the details. And I wish that I had listened to the stories better and that I'd taken notes. I used to take notes. And then, of course, over time, I don't know where the notes went to. But, if I could just bring some people back, I would pick their brains. My dad, Bill Gay, who ran the train station and wrote for me for a while. And there were many, actually, who are gone. But it was, owning a newspaper is both rewarding and extremely challenging.
So when did you wrote for the paper? Did you? Or did you?
I did. Yeah. No, I did write for the paper. I wasn't really a reporter. I would write editorials. There were times when I was both the publisher and the editor. So I wrote editorials. And for a time, we had a magazine called Spotlight, and I would write for Spotlight. But mostly I was an editor. I was not an easy editor either because I wanted things to be just so.
And one of the big failings today, whether you're writing books or you're reading newspapers, is you see that there are fewer and fewer editors because some of the mistakes that you see in really sort of notable newspapers today, I read it and I think that didn't get a seventh look, which would be typical when we were flourishing.
Right. That's right. Yeah.
So what influenced you to write this?
Well, I think it was cumulative. So it's an idea that has been percolating with me since probably about 2004, 2005. That's when I took over the Free Press from my dad. And I started to, Bill Gay, actually. So since I mentioned Bill, I should just, say that he wrote for us for a time. He had a column called As I See It, I think. And he ran the Essex train station, and he had a long career in marketing, radio marketing. And so Bill had quite an interest in local history. And he would come into my office at least once a week and sit, and we would talk about, the good old days. Now, his good old days were very different than my good old days, but he would give me really useful information. Yeah. And there was a point where we said, someday we really should write a book together. And of course, we didn't do anything, but that's where it started. And that would have been, about 20 years ago. And then it just sort of percolated from there. And I am not a hoarder at all, but I like to collect historic details, like whether it's written things, writing down details, photographs, documents, land records, whatever. If they come my way, I tuck them away, and then I think someday I will get back to that. So I've got several bins of historic information related to Essex. So when I decided to do this, I already had a good start. I just had to figure out a way to record the information in a meaningful way so that I could go back and find it. So I created, a series of charts and spreadsheets and things like that to track information basically chronologically, right?
Wow. Yeah. And then did you make a concerted decision to, actually do it chronologically, to write the book, from in a linear period?
Well, I did.
Yeah.
I did. And what I should say is, when I landed on the fact that Richard Thornton was the main character, I realized that I had to go back to 1830 because Richard Thornton was one of those early settlers along Talbot Road. And he wasn't one of the settlers right in the 2 lots in the town of Essex, but he was just outside, and he was absolutely influential. I think that's what took me back in time, but then I had to bring it back up to 1873, which is when the railroad was opened. The first train went through in May of 1873, and I had to figure out a way to get me from there to 1873. So linear was the logical way to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think this particular book lends itself to linear because I was trying to get to 1884 when Essex became a village. But then I realized, no, I got to go all the way to 1890 when it becomes a town. And that's the story, from the first settler to when it becomes a town. And then there's more to say after that. But for now, that was a good story to tell.
Yeah. And there are so many really interesting characters and events in the book. Was there any one particular character you thought, wow, am I ever glad I've learned about that person?
Well, there are a few. I've always been interested in why the roads in Essex are named certain things. Like, why is it called Wilson Avenue? Why is it called Day Street? So I went looking for the people with those names. And so George Wilson is a good example of someone who fascinates me because he was from Amherstburg. He was a land speculator who partnered with Alexander Cameron, who was a Windsor lawyer who also was a very large land speculator. But George Wilson sort of took Essex on as his pet project. And so Wilson Avenue is named after him. He built the first, one of the first large mercantile businesses. It had 3 units below, and it had a public hall on the 2nd floor because a new town needs a public hall, a place for people to gather. Yeah. And he also built a warehouse because with the train going through, farmers were bringing their produce and they needed a place to put the grain. So they created a grain warehouse. So he was visionary and had deep pockets, I assume. So he he realized what the town needed, and he started to help fill some of those voids. So George Wilson is a good example. But the best example, I think, of someone who I'm really happy that I sorted out was a man named Edwin C. Lewis. And there's always been a bit of a mystery amongst local historians as to how the Grand Central Hotel, which used to be on Main Street until the 1980 explosion, and then it had to be demolished. Afterwards, the Grand Central Tavern was built in its place, right beside the old Shinkles. And Lewis had come to Essex early on and was in construction. So he helped build the first church in Essex, and he was very active that way. He also was the toll gate keeper for Alexander Cameron because County Road 34, Talbot Road, was a toll road for many decades. And
I found that fascinating.
It's shocking how long it went and how controversial it was, right? How annoying it would be to have to pay every time you wanted to get into town or out of town. So I'm not sure which way it went, but E.C. Lewis was the toll gatekeeper, he and his wife, for Cameron for many years. And so they were collecting all the money. The interesting thing about Lewis is that in the 1880s, he decided to build a hotel, and he called it the Grand Central Hotel, but it was on the Gosfield town line in the township of Gosfield. And it was outside of Colchester where temperance was in effect, so he could serve liquor. He had a time getting a liquor license, but he eventually got his liquor license. What I find interesting about it is that there is mention of the Grand Central Hotel in the early newspaper records, and we all assumed that they were talking about the one in downtown Essex. But that was called Center House, and then it was renamed American House, and then eventually it was named Grand Central Tavern after E.C. Lewis's hotel burnt down. So in any case, I know it sounds convoluted, and it is, but it is a bit of a mystery, and he is pivotal to all of the information related to the toll roads. So,
wow.
And he was basically pretty much forgotten. Nothing is named after him.
No.
And he, I think because he was the toll gatekeeper, I don't think that people would have necessarily
liked him.
Yeah.
I would say not.
Yeah.
Now, the other fellow I thought might be interesting is Talbot. Mm-hmm. I mean, he's got a pretty significant road named after him.
Absolutely. Yes, I mean, he was quite a character. I don't know if he ever set foot in the area that would be called Essex today, but everyone up until about 1838 had to go up to Port Talbot, which was his settlement, and they had to see him personally to apply for land. So all of the original settlers would have gone to Talbot and asked him for land. And he was, I call him capricious, the most capricious land agent in Ontario, because if he liked you, he would give you land, and he might even give you the land you wanted. But if he didn't like you, you might not get any land. He was partial to certain people from certain parts of Europe and not so partial to others.
And I understand the road, Talbot Road, was bad. Like the quality of the road wasn't very good.
No, not at all. No, not at all. Now that was, I think, partly because road maintenance was not a provincial government or a municipal government responsibility for many, many years. So the settlers themselves had to clear the road, but then no one came along and gravelled it or did anything to improve it. So what the government decided to do was to sell off pieces of the road, and this is how we ended up with toll roads. So Alexander Cameron, who had his hands in all kinds of projects, was supposed to maintain that road. But the records show that, most of the money went into his own pocket and he didn't put it into maintenance. So it was always just, a muddy mess, right?
Wow.
Yeah, and most of the year it was just a sea of mud. Yeah, they called it Cameron's Creek. Yeah.
And I was fascinated to learn how significant the Upper Canada Rebellion was to this area.
one of the reasons that I wanted to research this, I wasn't sure that I was actually ever going to write a book, but I thought there were gaps in our knowledge. And that was one of those areas where I figured, some of these people who settled along the road had to have been in the militia, because all men between the ages of 16 and 60 had to be in the militia unless there was an exemption. And there were very few exemptions. So I went looking for military records. And this is the beauty of digitized records. Of course, I found them.
Wow.
And so I was able to piece together who was in the local militia, where they were stationed, how much they were paid, their weeks of service. And then I went a little bit further because I needed to understand the context of it. So which battles would they potentially have been involved in? Who would have been the commanders? What would have happened when they all arrived in Amherstburg and needed to be billeted or housed and fed and whatnot. So I just researched until I was satisfied that I had, the beginning of a story, right? So I included it.
So we got a lot of people out of that rebellion.
Yeah, absolutely.
Interesting. Yeah. And around that, I think, was it around that period that local government started to evolve?
After the rebellion.
Yeah.
Yes, after, I think it was the Durham Report in 1840. And they were trying to sort out the folks in England were trying to sort out, why did this happen? And they realized that they had a whole citizenship that was disempowered, and they needed to, allow them to self-govern to some extent. Yeah, and that is when local government started to evolve.
So let's go back to the muddy road for a moment. There's a lovely passage in there I'd like you to read about what the place was like. It certainly wasn't like the Essex we know today when the settlers arrived.
Sure. Well, this actually would be in 1873. Excuse me. This is a passage about John Milne, who was the town's first mayor. He wasn't the village's first mayor. That was Dr. Bryan. But in 1890, when Essex became a town, John Milne was acclaimed as mayor. And he was mayor for several terms. He was extremely influential and powerful in Essex.
How long were the terms? Do you know?
They were only 1 year for the longest time. And the election was every January. Now, only certain people could vote. You had to own property and be male and, various.
The usual.
It was a small electorate. But, they were annual. Can you imagine running an annual election?
Oh my gracious! There would be uproar, uprisings.
Yes, there would be. There would be. It was interesting. So John Milne arrived in Essex in 1873, and he had contracts with the railroad, which was the Canada Southern Railway at that time, and he came down because he needed to scope out the area. He'd been given a contract to clear the trees so many feet, I think it was 6 feet, away from the railroad tracks so that the rail bed could dry. And so his job was not actually to cut down the trees, but to find crews that would cut down the trees. So this short passage is about his arrival in Essex in 1873, before there was anything here. So it was during this uncommonly wet spring that 34-year-old John Milne made his first trip to Essex Centre by pony, riding from Canfield, Ontario, just east of Cayuga, and following the Talbot Road a distance of about 200 miles. As the CSR would not open the new rail line for pedestrian and freight traffic until May 20th, Milne's options for transportation were limited. According to his memoir, he arrived at the Essex crossing about 5 o'clock in the afternoon on the third day. Milne's memoir provides his initial impressions of Essex, and this is a quote from this memoir. There were only 2 log houses where the present town of Essex now stands, but the Royal Hotel was being built where the present electric railway station now is. The carpenters were working inside. Now, the property that he's referring to here is the property that the Royal Canadian Legion sits on today. First, it was the Royal Hotel, and then after the hotel was disassembled. There was a bit of a fire and then it was disassembled, but it became the electric railway station. So he's referring to it there in the, I think, 1920s. I met Mr. McLeod, who was to be the proprietor of the Royal Hotel. He had a barn where he could put my horse in, but he had no furniture yet in the house. He said he expected a load of furniture down from Windsor that evening, and if it came, he could fit me up a bed, and we could eat at the log house across the road, which was used as the halfway house for the stage, running between Windsor and Leamington. I put my horse in the stable and waited. In about 2 hours, there came down a great big load of furniture, and I helped to carry up the furniture to the bedroom I would sleep in. So I was the first guest to sleep in a hotel in Essex.
Wow.
So there were 2 houses, 2 hotels, a railroad, and at that point, not much else.
But it's interesting, 2 hotels.
Yeah.
Hard pressed to find one now.
I know. People were very optimistic then. I believe that they were less risk averse. We would be very risk averse.
Yes.
And I think back then, there was no real credit. I mean, I suppose you could get loans from somebody, but there was no real credit as we know it today. And so they would take everything that they had and throw it into some sort of venture and hope that it would be successful or sell it quickly. So the 2 hotels, one started east of Essex and one started west of Essex, and they both got moved into town when the train was expected to go through. And I think this happened in other towns across Ontario. Wherever the train crossed a road, that's where it was logical for businesses to begin. And hotels were the first because there were no houses. So where were people going to sleep? Right?
Absolutely.
Where were the businesses going to set up? So many early businesses set up in the hotels. So the surveyor, James Laird, set up in one hotel. Dr. Bryan, the physician, set up in another hotel. And then I saw evidence of other businesses setting up in the hotels.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
When you sort of look at what Essex is today and everything, the activity that's going on there today. And, it's really interesting to be able to go back and read this history of sort of how it all got started. Yeah. And the railway really made a difference.
Absolutely. No, Essex would not exist without the railway. Yeah. That's a certainty. Yeah.
And going back to John Milne, he was involved in the temperance movement, wasn't he?
Oh, just about everybody was. There was, a great deal of pressure to be in the temperance movement. Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm sure that the churches pushed that as well. He belonged to the Methodist Episcopal Church, and I think the Methodist churches were in favor of that because it created, at the time, alcoholism and just over drinking was a huge problem. And I think it just created more of a civilized society, right?
The Toronto Daily Mail, I was reading, called Essex a go-ahead town in, was it 1892?
Yes.
Significant to be quoted in a national newspaper.
It absolutely it was. And, that is one of the key sources of information we have about early Essex, because this man named Mr. Beach, W.W. Beach, came to Essex, stayed for a few weeks, took photographs, spoke to all of the key, business people and town officials, and then went back to Toronto and wrote the story. I think Essex was considered remarkable because in only, at that point, 19 years, it had gone from being, the 2 hotels and 2 houses to being, the front of this book, right?
Yes, absolutely.
And so it's considered, remarkable. And much of that is, credited to John Milne because he bought a sawmill that he did not intend to buy, I'm sure, when he first went there, but he turned it into a major industrial operation. He was making tractors and I'm not sure what all that he was doing, but a whole industrial complex, which was basically where, the No Frills Plaza, that it was rated, it's where the old Stokely's plant used to be. Some people will remember the old Stokely's plant at the head of Laird Avenue, but across the street. And that's where Milne built just a huge complex, 3-story, large industrial building.
Was there anything that surprised you?
I was thrilled when I discovered E.C. Lewis and his hotel. I was surprised. Sadler's Pond, everybody in Essex, if you've grew up in Essex, you know Sadler's Pond. It started because of, it was a brickyard, and they just dug so much clay. And many of the first homes and the first commercial buildings in Essex were made from local clay, right? Local bricks. And so I was surprised to discover that was the origin of Sadler's Pond. We all knew it was man-made, but we didn't know where it came from. So that was a surprise. Yeah. There were other, many surprises along the way, little surprises. Mostly things that I had no idea that used to be Dr. Bryan's house.
Right.
That, that Laird lived on the property that is now the beer store. The house is not there. Yeah. But just little details like that.
And it's 150 years. Essex is celebrating.
Yes.
I wouldn't have known it was 150 years if I hadn't read your book. And so Essex should have a celebration.
Yes. Well, I agree. I've done my best to encourage that. But I think the Fun Fest Parade this year has a theme that is related to the rising village I'm not going to get this right, but from the rising village to the modern town or something like that. So they're going to play off of that as well.
So before I let you go, where can people buy your book?
Well, it's available at bookstores like, Juniper and Biblioasis and River Books. Yep. It's available at the train station. The historical societies like the Marsh Collection in Amherstburg.
Excellent.
AIRS, the Harrow Early Immigrant Research Society in Harrow, Eckers in Essex, the Essex and Community Historical Research Society, the Maidstone Museum. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
This is delightful.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, that's it for another edition of Scribes and Songsters. And what a delightful conversation we've just had with my guest, Laurie Brett. Thank you to our Scribes and Songsters team, producer Liz Pettipies-Phillips, technical producer and editor Gary Glass, social media manager Michelle Fortier, and consultant producer Brian Sweet. Grateful thanks to Tony Toldo and the Toldo Foundation, and to Neil and Tina Queering for their support. Thank you for watching. Hope to see you soon right back here on Scribes and Songsters. I'm Veronique Mandel. Bye for now.